All right, for number 4, using f of x equals the cosine of x as a guide, graph g of x equals 4 times, or secant of 4x. This secant is 1 over the cosine of 4x. So let's graph cosine of 4x first. Now, when we're graphing cosine of 4x, the period of that for a cosine graph is going to be 2 pi over the absolute value of b. So we're going to get 2 pi over 4, reducing that to pi over 2. That means it's going to complete one full wave between 0 and pi over 2. Now, since we're graphing a cosine graph, we have to talk about the amplitude. The amplitude of a normal cosine graph, if there's nothing multiplied out front, it's just 1. So a cosine graph typically starts off at its highest point. And I'm going to draw this cosine graph in blue. So it's going to start off at its highest point, at its amplitude, and it's going to complete a full wave in its period. So it's going to complete a full wave between 0 and pi over 2. So it's going to reach that amplitude again over here. Now halfway between those two highest points, it's going to have to reach its lowest point, which is going to reach down to -1. And then also halfway between its highest point and its lowest point, it's going to have to cross that midline, which happens to be our x-intercept here. Now we're going to keep this pattern going throughout the rest of this graph. So that we can draw a nice cosine wave. All right, so our cosine wave, it's pretty skinny. And since our amplitude is just 1, it's pretty short. Again, do your best to make this a nice curve. If you need to take it in pieces, go for it. Just try not to draw perfectly straight lines. Okay, so there's our basic cosine graph. Now we're asked to identify the period. The nice thing about the cosine graph relating to the secant graph is the period's the exact same. The asymptotes is the other part I want you to look at. So the asymptotes, two ways you can look at it. The asymptotes for our secant graph are the x-intercepts for our cosine graph. So everywhere you have an x-intercept on your cosine graph, you're going to have an asymptote on your secant graph. So you can just draw some asymptotes going through all those x-intercepts. I missed. Let's try that again. Rats. Let me try that one again. Again, kind of like the previous one, these are going to be pretty skinny. The asymptotes, the equation that I give you is, oops, sorry, that's in shape mode still. So it's pi over 2 times absolute value of b plus pi n over b. So again, our b value is 4, so it's going to be pi over 8 plus pi n over 4. Looking at this, we could identify that as well, because this first asymptote here is at pi over 8, because it's halfway between 0 and pi over 4, and the next one is essentially 1 tick mark over. So 1 tick mark represents pi over 4. Now for the rest of this graph, we just have to draw curves that go in the opposite direction of our cosine graph. So if you have a cosine graph that's opening, or part of that graph is opening down, the secant graph is going to be opening up. And those curves are going to stay within the boundaries of those asymptotes. And it just keeps repeating that pattern. But the curves share those vertices. And the secant and the cosine graphs open in opposite directions. Again, you can continue that graph between every asymptote.